Welcome to The Stacks, a podcast about books and the people who read them. I'm your host, Tracy Thomas, and today I am honored to welcome to The Stacks Adam Higginbotham. Adam's new book is called Challenger, a true story of heroism and disaster on the edge of space. It is a thoroughly researched, dramatic, and absolutely devastating work of investigative journalism about the space shuttle tragedy on January 28th, 1986. The book gives us a riveting minute-by-minute account of the events, including a ton of new archival research that you'll appreciate no matter how familiar you are with these events. Adam is also the best-selling author of Midnight in Chernobyl, another stunning book that was turned into the television series Chernobyl on HBO. Today, we talk about Adam's research process, why he wanted to tell another story set in 1986, and why it was important for him to focus on the crew and astronauts involved in this tragedy. Remember, our July book club selection is Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler, which we will discuss on Wednesday, July 31st with Emily Roboteau. Everything we talk about on each episode of The Stacks can be found in the link in the show notes. If you love this podcast and you want inside access to it, head to patreon.com/thestacks and join the Stacks Pack. It is just $5 a month, and for that, you get to join the best bookish community that has ever existed in the history of the universe, and that has been fact-checked, at least by me. You get to be part of our Discord community, our monthly virtual book club meetups, you get a bonus episode each month, and you get to know that by joining the Stacks Pack, you make it possible for me to make this independent podcast about books. A fun perk of joining the Stacks Pack over on Patreon is that you get a shout out on this very podcast. So here's a huge thank you to Jumi Bello, Sarah, Jen, Renee, Allison Spink, and Fabiola. Thank you all so much. And if you are one of those people that's like, I don't want to be part of the best bookish community that ever existed, but I do still want to support Tracy and the work of the Stacks, well, you can do that. You can subscribe to the newsletter. There is a free and $5 option. It is called Unstacked. It is at tracythomas.substack.com. You can find out what I'm up to. You can get my hot take on books. You can see what I'm reading, what I'm excited about. And again, all of that goes to supporting this independent podcast. tracythomas.substack.com. Okay, that's it. Now it's time for my conversation with Adam Higginbotham. All right, everybody. If you've been following me on social media, you know that I am very into this book and this next author guest. I am joined today by Adam Higginbotham. His latest book is called Challenger, a true story of heroism and disaster on the edge of space. Adam, welcome to the Stacks.
Thank you for having me.
I'm thrilled. I loved this book. This is exactly the kind of book that I want to love and that I love to read, but they're not always done as well as this. I feel like you get an A+ from me. I'm like starstruck because I'm so excited to ask you all my questions. But before I get to all my questions, we always sort of start here, which is about in 30 seconds or so. Could you just tell folks generally about the book?
Yes, I guess I can. Nobody's ever asked me to do that before, but yes,
really?
I can, It is a narrative nonfiction account of the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, which happened in January 1986. It follows each member of the crew of 7 who died that day, and their path to the launch pad that morning. And it explores the background to the accident, how it happened, how a small handful of rocket engineers at a government contractor named Morton Thiokol tried to stop the launch happening on the eve of launch. And then it follows the investigation and the hunt for the wreckage of the shuttle, which crashed into the Atlantic. I think that's it.
I think that's it. I think you did a great job. I feel like you know the book well. Okay, so your previous book was a book about Chernobyl, also 1986. That also is the year that I was born. So I'm curious if you want to write a book about my life, because I feel like you're the 1986 guy, and I'm sure there's other interesting things that happen, but nothing more interesting than my birth, obviously.
Obviously. Well, let me put it this way, Tracy. Was it within the first 3 months of 1986?
No. So you have to progress. You have to get to July, late July.
Okay.
But it's your next book, so you can progress deeper. By book 5 or 6, you'll be in December. I don't know what happened, but I'm sure something.
I did. When I was finishing up the final corrections on the manuscript, I did have an evening where I thought to myself, now I'm going to settle back and I'm going to relax and I'm going to have nothing to do with any of this time period or the subject matter. I'm going to just fire up Netflix and I'm going to watch a documentary. So, I turn it on, the algorithm gets going, and I see, oh, there's a documentary series here about the assassination of Olaf Palmer.
Was that 1986?
The assassination of Olaf Palmer, the Norwegian prime minister who was shot under very mysterious circumstances. And I start it, and I'm thinking, and then the first title card comes up, and it says March 1986, and I was just like, no!
What were you doing in 1986?
It was the year I turned 18.
Oh my God.
So I was in January 1986, I was 17. So I was at school. And I do remember it very clearly because I remember the day of the Challenger accident very clearly because of the time difference. It launched at 11:38 in Florida. So that is about 4:38 in English time at that time of the year. So I was at school and I just got out of school. And this is a very 20th century story. I was, there's no social media, there's no cell phones. I just went out with my friends after school. And I did, nobody had a phone. Nobody got the news through any instantaneous means. So it wasn't until I got home that night, about 9 or 10 o'clock, that my mother, who'd been watching the evening news, told me what had happened. And I still remember how kind of incomprehensible I found it that this had happened.
Writing about the story now, almost 40 years later, a lot of people don't know this story, don't remember this story. Anyone younger than me wasn't alive for this story, right? So were you interested in writing towards those people and telling this story, or were you thinking of your audience more as people who were familiar with this story and sort of had heard the phrase O-rings before?
Well, it was that group of people that was one of the reasons that prompted me to want to write the book in the first place, because although I remember it very clearly, I gradually realized, much as with the Chernobyl accident, that there's a whole generation of readers that weren't around and maybe, unaware that it happened at all, although I think that's unlikely, but they certainly wouldn't know the details of it. And most importantly, really, they wouldn't understand quite what a turning point in American history it was, because, up to this point, NASA as an organization had seemed like something that was capable of achieving the impossible on an almost regular basis.
Right.
And in a world after Challenger, and then especially after the Columbia accident, which happened in 2003, when NASA lost a second shuttle and a second crew of 7, it doesn't seem so shocking that something like this could happen. But back in January 1986, this was, this convulsed the nation.
It's so interesting because I don't even remember the Columbia disaster. Like when I was reading the book, I got to the end and I was like, this sounds vaguely familiar. Like this maybe I do. And I was in high school then, right? I would have been 17 or so. And it's just so interesting that it never got the same play as Challenger. It's not, people talk about Challenger as being the defining moment for certain generations, like the JFK assassination or like 9/11 for my generation. And I just think it's so interesting that the Columbia sort of is a thing that maybe people remember, but wasn't like a thing. Is that because there was no teacher in space? Is that because it wasn't on TV in the same way? People weren't gearing up for it in the same way that they were the Challenger? Or is it because Challenger happened and so they knew it could happen?
I think it's much more the case that it's because Challenger happened and they knew it could happen. That was something that I did talk to people who were there on the day at the Kennedy Space Center watching it in person. One of the most remarkable things about the news footage that you see from that time is that there's quite a long period when people who were watching it from the ground didn't know what had happened. And so there's both silence from people in the crowd, but there's also cheering because people think that what they can see when these two rockets, the solid rockets, start going in opposite directions across the sky, that's actually part of what, the planned descent phase was. But once that had happened, nobody was ever going to make that mistake again. Nobody who was going to witness a catastrophe like this would ever think, oh, well, this is obviously normal. It's just, there's some glitch.
Right.
So I think that's a lot of it, because it was covered on television. It was covered live on television in a way that actually Challenger wasn't, because Challenger was, by that time, it had become, the process of launching space shuttles had begun to seem so routine that the three national television networks had stopped covering the launches live. So they only
they didn't cover Challenger?
No. It was only CNN that was covering it live, and CNN had just started it was a very recent invention at that point. And also NASA's dedicated satellite channel was feeding the launch footage directly into hundreds of classrooms across the country because of the Teacher in Space program. There are at least 2.5 million kids watching it live. So it seems quite likely that the majority of the people who are watching it in real time were actually children.
That's so interesting. And because it's a different time period, like their parents could have had no idea, at least for a little bit. And the kids are like being traumatized at home or at school, and the parents are at work and they're not tuning into CNN necessarily. That's crazy.
Right. So a really sort of important and fascinating part of the story was how that news spread.
Right. When you went into writing this book, I've heard you talk about, I think somewhere else, you said you sort of wanted to explore this thing that everybody sort of remembered and was this huge moment. And I'm curious, like, going into it, before you started doing all your research, before you started conducting your interviews, what was the thing that you were most interested in sort of figuring out? And now on the back end, after having done all your research, written the book, what's the piece of this story that still sort of sits in your brain where you're like, I just can't get this out of my head?
There were two things that I really wanted to make sure that I brought to the story. And one was, as I said before, the stories of all of the members of the crew. So, in previous tellings of this story have concentrated quite understandably, on the story of Krista McAuliffe, the teacher in space. But there were 6 other people on the crew. And I don't really think that many people knew very much about them. So I wanted to explain where they came from, and what kind of people they were. And also to show really what the space shuttle program achieved before 1986, because this is the other thing, is the problem with looking at it solely in retrospect, is that people don't really realize, on one hand, how ambitious and kind of unbelievable it was to do what they did in creating this reusable spacecraft that could take off from the ground like a rocket and then go into orbit like a spaceship, but then come back down and land on a runway just like an airliner, and then be prepared
to
do it all again. And so that at the time was kind of staggering that was possible, but also that people were incredibly excited about it. When the first one landed, a crowd of 250,000 people turned out in the California desert to watch it happen, and understandably, all of the successes and the achievements of the program before Challenger have really been overshadowed by both the Challenger accident and then the Columbia accident. And so it's really seen, I think, as a failure, and just it's renowned for these 2 disasters. But I wanted to tell the story in a way that showed, both personally for obviously for the members of the crew's families, but also as a nation, and as an institution within NASA, what was lost in the accident. And I think that you can only really understand, how shattering it was when you understand, what we and they lost in the accident.
Yeah, I think you do. There's 3 things that I love the most about this book. 2 of them are the 2 things you just said, right? I loved learning the history of sort of the program, and you start with a disaster in the 1960s, like an accident where 3 astronauts are killed, and that's sort of where we start the book after the little or the prologue thing. And I loved that, and I loved seeing sort of the
well, for me, what I liked about seeing the history was also seeing the sort of institutional ego of NASA. I think that's like become such a huge part of this story. And you frame it so well by setting it up of like, these people died, but then like we did make it to the moon and we saved other disasters, and like we can do anything, right? And that sort of ethos like carries out through the institution all the way, even through Columbia. And I loved getting to meet the other astronauts. I can name all 7 of them, which feels crazy to me, something that I never would have been able to do before, right? And I think like I was just watching a documentary and I was looking and I was like, okay, that's Dick Scobie. Like, okay, I did it. But the third thing that you do, which is what sets this book apart to me, is that we all know what happens in the end of the Challenger story, or most of us do. And if you don't, there's a major malfunction, because in the prologue, that's sort of where you end with it. But by the time I got to the end of this book, or by the time I got to not even the end, by the time I got to the week of the disaster, I guess the section that starts with January 10th, I was sitting reading, being like, there's no way. There's no way they're going to send these people to space. We go through the meeting with Morton Thiokol and the conference call the night before, and they lay out the case. And I'm like, there's no way they're going to approve it. They approve it. I'm like, okay. Then McDonald's like, it's icy. Like, there's these other reasons. Maybe they won't do it. I'm like, yeah, McDonald, they're not going to do it. There's no way. They get to countdown. I'm like, there's no way. And it goes up in space. And I'm like, it's not going to blow up. You took me all the way through this book where I was like, I can't believe this. I just can't believe this. And I think that shows your skill as a storyteller. But I think there's a craft thing that you're doing. And I'm just curious if you can explain how you were thinking about writing it, because there was never a moment until it happened that I thought that the Challenger was going to explode in this book, even though you told us it was going to, and I knew that it was going to.
I mean, that is kind of crazy, because you're not the only person that said that you're kind of carried through the narrative, and you, right up until it happens, you're thinking that it might not not happen.
Have you ever seen Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet?
I haven't, no.
Okay. This is like a very lowbrow comparison, but that movie at the end, when Juliet is on the altar, I'm sure you're familiar with Romeo and Juliet, where Juliet's on the altar and Romeo's there. And in the movie, the way he has it set up is that like her fingers start to quiver and you see she's waking up, but he doesn't notice it. And then he kills himself right as she's waking up. And every time I see that movie, I'm like, he's going to wake up in time. And that's exactly how I felt reading this book. I was like, they're going to say no, they're going to stop it.
I mean, it's amazing that you experience it that way. And, and I'm obviously glad that other people have responded to it that way, because it means that they're engaged with the narrative. But I must admit that I don't think you could do that intentionally. I didn't do that intentionally. I mean, I just wanted to make sure that, because you're telling a story where everybody knows what happens in the end, you've got to make sure that you're engaged with, and you come to know the protagonists well enough, and that they seem as real as they were, and that it rings true in that way. And I think that's one of the things that makes you not believe that what's going to happen is actually going to happen, is because you're kind of experiencing it in real time. And I must admit, particularly when I was going through all of the interview transcripts, the investigative transcripts that were done by the investigators who were sent out on behalf of the Rogers Commission to interview all of the 34 men, they were all men, who were in that teleconference the night before the launch took place. When I was looking at what those people described and what they said, I just couldn't kind of believe the way that they felt about what was happening and what was said in the meeting. And specifically that it reaches a point where, it all comes down to this vote by 4 senior managers at Morton Thiokol. And 3 of them agree almost immediately to change their recommendation, which had been no go for launch, to go for launch. Yeah. And then there's one left, but it's got to be a unanimous decision. And that he clearly, it's clear to everyone else in the room that he doesn't want to change his mind, that he thinks this is a terrible mistake, that he knows what the possible consequences are if he's wrong, but he does it anyway. And when I was reading the different accounts of that, I found that unbelievable.
I'm like getting emotional hearing you talk about this, even though I know I can't believe he changed his vote. There's a part where you talk about how everyone on the conference call before they do their little breakout meeting, there's things that are said and everyone is like, well, I guess this isn't happening because like there's no way NASA can come back from this conversation. Like the other people said, we're not going to do it if Morton Thiokol says not to do it. And then they do it. Like, right. I just can't believe they do it. Like, I don't know. Maybe I'll just never believe it. I think something that's interesting about this event to me is it sort of feels like an unsatisfying story in a lot of ways. Like that even with all the information and all of the answers, and we know what happened and we know why, and we know who said what and what failed and all of this, that I still don't feel settled around this story. I don't know if you have a sense of that at all, or if you understand why I might be feeling this way. Not that you're my therapist or anything.
But so you mean that it doesn't make sense that they changed their minds this way?
Well, I don't know what it is. There are certain like events and disaster type things. Because again, this is like what I really like to read, where I sort of feel like the corruption or mistakes make sense to me. And I'm like, I understand how this happened. But even knowing all the information, I just don't understand how this thing could have happened.
I think that's partly, I don't know how much you recalled about it before you started reading the book, but I think that the way that it was reported at the time, especially in the immediate aftermath of the Rogers Commission publishing their report, which they did in June 1986, there were a lot of people who thought that the couple of middle managers at NASA who were responsible for pushing through the launch decision should have been prosecuted for criminal negligence. And there was a real tone in the reporting where, people clearly thought that they had knowingly sent people to their deaths, that they understood the risks and they decided to press ahead regardless, and they were extremely reckless in doing so. And I talk to retired NASA engineers now who actually refer to those guys as murderers. Right. But I think that if you think about it that way, it clearly seems inexplicable because the way that version of the story is told relies upon supposing that these are guys who want to push through this incredibly dangerous launch because they're interested in keeping their jobs and keeping their bosses happy. But if you follow that line of reasoning through, then so they know that there's going to be a catastrophic accident and it's going to destroy the space shuttle and kill 7 astronauts. But they go through with it because they want to keep their jobs. That doesn't make any sense. Clearly, they're not. If they're deemed to be responsible for what happens, they're not going to be keeping their jobs. Right. And indeed, the entire agency might, be so badly damaged it would be dissolved. But I think that what I found is when I talked to people that knew those guys, and I read both what they said under questioning by the Rogers Commission and by the investigators afterwards, and in interviews that they've done in the years since, I don't think that's the case at all. I think that they thought that they were making the right decision. They thought that they understood the engineering questions at hand, and they really honestly believed that they were making an accurate assessment of what they regarded as acceptable risk. They'd done it many, many times before. They'd come across lots of engineering glitches and problems with the solid rockets and many other aspects of the space shuttle system. And they just thought they were right. They were arrogant, definitely. Yeah. And the way that they talked about the decision that they made afterwards definitely has seemed callous and reckless. But I just think that they thought they were right, and they were wrong.
Right. Because what is it, Lucas, who said in an interview, like, I would do it again? If I had the same information, knowing what I know now, I would do it again. I just watched that documentary last night, actually. Right. And you write it about it in the book, but even seeing him say it, I was like, oh my God, it's like, it gave me chills. But I think, like, do you get the sense in your research and your interviews and talking to people that folks felt betrayed by NASA, that the astronauts, other astronauts who weren't on the flight, obviously, but the families of the ones who were, civilians more broadly, like, was there a sense that NASA betrayed a level of trust, or did it seem like most folks felt like they understood that it was an acceptable risk?
The astronauts definitely felt that they'd been betrayed by NASA, and they felt that way because, they just wanted to be advised of what risks they were taking.
Right.
And several of them have said in the years after the accident that the reason that they were angry is because NASA engineers knew about these problems with the O-rings sealing the rockets together, and that they knew that a leak in these joints was possible, and therefore a catastrophe was possible. But this was something that was an issue that was never raised in the post-flight meetings that astronauts might have learned of. Astronauts did not sit on those meetings, generally speaking, and when they did, on the rare occasions when they did, that specific problem was not made to seem like it was much of a big deal. And so they were angry because they understood all the other risks of flying the space shuttle. They knew it was an experimental spacecraft, and they'd been kept in the dark about this one, and so that's what they were upset about. And subsequently, several of them have said that had they known about those risks, they would probably have flown anyway.
Right.
They just wanted to be told, to be able to make their own assessment.
Yeah. Okay, let's take a quick break and we'll be right back. Valentine's Day is upon us, and I've got love on the brain. Love for books. Duh, of course. Hello. Did you forget what podcast you're listening to? I love bringing you all great reads, exclusive author interviews, and behind-the-scenes book gossip. But I can only do that with your support over on Patreon and Substack. Our Stacks Patreon community, also known as the Stacks Pack, is where you can go for book club meetups, a private, very active Discord, and a year-long mega reading challenge to help you achieve all your reading goals. Plus, you also get that monthly bonus episode. Now, over on the Substack, you can subscribe to my newsletter, Unstacked, where I keep the book conversations going. I also give you a healthy dose of sports and pop culture, definitely some hot takes happening over there. And again, that bonus episode. If you don't have a few dollars to spare, don't worry. There are free options on the Substack and the Patreon to get you a little extra Stacks magic. Making this podcast is a total team effort, and by supporting my Patreon and my Substack, you allow me to support my amazing team that makes the show possible every single week. So if you or your friends are looking to meet other book lovers and support this indie podcast, come hang out with me on Patreon, Substack, or both. I would love to have you. And since we're talking about love, you can gift subscriptions to the Patreon and the Substack for that special reader in your life. For the Stacks Pack, head to patreon.com/thestacks. And for the newsletter, head to tracythomas.substack.com. And also, there are links to both in the show notes. Okay, see you in the Stacks. Okay. This might be a stupid question. This is the one question I have for you from the book, which is, why do we go to space? Why are we doing this like once a month? Why were they trying to go so often? What were they doing up there? Just learning things?
Yeah, I mean, behind all of the specific things that they were doing is just the natural human impulse to explore and to do things that people haven't done before.
I don't have that impulse. I'm more of a house cat myself. I like to like the thought of going to space is very upsetting to me. Just the idea of it, like watching videos of the launches, very upsetting. It seems very dangerous. I don't like it. People floating up there, terrifying. But I guess
So I mean, in the broader sense, I think there is that atavistic, impulse to explore, and most specifically, the astronauts themselves had trained for years and incredibly intensively at great personal cost to do this one thing, that on a space shuttle mission would last a maximum of a week. So by the time they get down to Cape Canaveral and go to the Kennedy Space Center to get ready to climb aboard the space shuttle and launch, that's all they want to do. That's all they want to do. So, which is one of the reasons why some of them have said, some of the surviving astronauts from that class have said since, if they told me about the cold weather and they told me about the problems with the O-rings on the morning of launch, I would still have gone ahead and done it. I would still have taken the risk because that's what I was there to do.
I just does not compute for me. Just, would you go to space?
No. I mean, at this point, I'm a 55-year-old man who holds the handrail when he goes down the steps into the subway. I'm not about to climb on board a rocket where even the revised figures for catastrophic risk are a chance of 1 in 270. I don't like those odds.
I don't like any odds. I'm stressed walking down the street. I'm like, not going to happen for me. Not interested, not curious. So you conducted you did different research than other folks. You found Roger Beaujolais' book, his memoir. You got access to that. He was one of the senior engineers at Morton Thiokol, who was really part of the team Do Not Launch. What was your approach? How were you conducting your interviews, your research? Who did you speak with that maybe other folks had not spoken with in the last 37 years? Like, what to you sets this book apart from other works about the Challenger, other movies and things? Like,
I think the one of the main things is to concentrate on the stories of each member of the crew, so you get a real sense of who each of them is. So in order to do that, I spoke to, as many surviving members of their families and their friends as I could. But also I in terms of, the sorts of stories that I write, I'm interested in building them around the arc of a handful of specific protagonists and making sure that those people come alive on the page as much as possible. So it meant that I wanted to talk to the friends and family of the crew, but also to find out as much as possible about the rocket engineers like Al McDonald and like Roger Beaujolais. And then I wanted to make sure that I fully understood in a way that I could tell the story in detail, the work of the Rogers Commission after the accident and how the investigation proceeded. And what I wasn't really prepared for was how kind of dramatic and fascinating that story in itself was. Because I must admit that I had assumed that, part of the reason this was a great thing to research was that at the time the accident happened, national newspapers were probably at the zenith of their level of resourcing and staffing. And so as soon as the accident happened, newspapers from all over the country sent teams of reporters down, and they catalogued everything they found and published, hundreds and thousands of stories about what had happened. And then, so when I came to go back into the newspaper archives and talk to reporters who were there at the time, this represented this kind of incredibly rich vein of narrative detail. And part of that, I assumed, would be somebody, the Washington Post or the LA Times, would have dedicated a group of these reporters to a series that they published in, 1987 or 1988, Inside the Rogers Commission, how they really arrived at their decisions. And when I reached that point in the research, I was like, oh, wait a minute. Nobody ever did that. That convenient sort of 10,000 word account in a newspaper archive, that's not there. So then I sat down and I went through I started by going through all of the New York Times daily coverage and built a timeline. And then I interviewed David Sanger, who was covering it for the Times at the time, and Bill Broad, who still writes, well, they both still write for the Times, but they were, young reporters working on the story at the time. And I also interviewed Al Keel, who was the right-hand man of William Rogers, who organised the whole commission and its proceedings, and just discovered that there was this amazing behind-the-scenes story of how they went about the work, how Rogers began to figure out that NASA were not being completely forthright about the decision-making process that led up to the launch, and then how they exposed that on the stand in front of television cameras.
And Feynman. Love Feynman.
Yes.
Oh my God. What a story. I did research on him after I finished the book. I was like, I got to know more about this guy. He had a sick wife when he was young, when he was in doing Los Alamos and all of that. And I mean,
yeah, he's
a
fascinating character. Yeah.
I need to read his biography. I was like, really fell in love with him. He and Roger Beaujolais were the two characters from the book that I just became so taken with their stories. I really loved them. I mean, we don't get a ton of Feynman because he comes in so late, but I was like, I love this character. Loudmouth, anti-establishment.
One thing that I only discovered when I read there's one really great biography of Feynman called Genius. The one thing that I discovered in that was that he was reluctant initially to take on the work of serving on the commission because he already knew that he was dying of cancer and that he knew that this was probably the last thing that he was going to get to do in his life. And I'd never read that in any other coverage of the Challenger investigation at all. And that just casts his behavior and everything that he does in a totally different light.
Yes. Oh my, yes. So totally. Okay. Speaking of the astronauts on board of the Challenger who died, you come to some interesting information that I'd never seen before, which was that potentially they were still alive, some of them at least, on the way down after the explosion, because there were these I guess like I was imagining them. I was like the emergency masks on airplanes, but some sort of like safety thing that only could be activated by an astronaut, I guess in this case
by hand, by turning it on.
Yeah, but it had to be done for you. You couldn't reach it yourself, and that it showed that the amount of oxygen or whatever that had been used was like exactly 2.5 minutes, which was how long it would have taken for the cabin to fall. And so maybe they weren't alive, but I always just assumed, that they had just perished immediately.
Right.
Was that new information for you?
No, I did.
Well known.
That was reported pretty extensively at the time.
Okay.
But it is something about the accident that a lot of people don't know because, in the years since, NASA has been quite reluctant to, go into any detail about that. And some of that stuff, the details of the autopsy, for instance, still remains confidential. But no, but no, the post-accident investigation and the autopsy and the investigation of the condition of the switches and the equipment that was recovered from the cabin definitely indicates that the crew at least some of the crew were certainly conscious, were certainly alive after the spacecraft broke up, and at least one of them was conscious for at least a short period of time, but it's impossible to know whether they were conscious for that 2.5 minutes.
Terrifying. Another detail in the book that is haunting me is about, you talk a lot about, from the beginning of the book, you talk a lot about all the information NASA has and all the sensors, and they have this. If this goes wrong, they'll see it on their computer in Houston or wherever. Like they can see everything. They've got sensors. They got a sensor for that. But throughout the course of this book, anytime a sensor shows a problem, a human being is like, I think the sensor is broken, override.
Right.
What's that about? Like, why do they have the sensors or they're just like, oh, these sensors break all the time. Like they just never fix the sensors. The sensors just are a suggestion.
Well, no, it's because there is one of the most fascinating people I met during the course of reporting the book was Jenny Stein, who her maiden name when she was working at NASA was Jenny Howard.
Jenny Howard. Okay, that's the story I'm talking about.
Right.
She was like, these are broken, but then she saved everybody.
So she was one of the few women engineers in mission control in the early phase of the shuttle program, and she was on the booster desk and therefore was responsible for overseeing everything that happened with the main engines of the shuttle and with the solid rocket boosters during the ascent phase. So during the first 8 minutes of the mission, when the time it takes to get into space. But she was someone who she was a kind of classic NASA type because she lived her job. She wanted to spend as much time as she possibly could to know the engines and the propulsion systems of the shuttle inside out. So she bought her own. They didn't have personal computers at NASA at the time because we were still using early 70s technology. So she went out and she bought herself one of the first Apple computers to use at home to run her own data analysis. So she knew how the engines behaved. She understood the sensor systems, and she understood extremely well which parts of the system were vulnerable to failure. And so this is one of the things you're talking about, is that she knew that quite frequently some of the sensors attached to the main engines, just gave false readings or went out and broke. And that was the nature of her job, was that she's the person who had to make that judgment call about whether or not the information that she was receiving on the ground was an accurate reflection of what was going on inside the engines. So although in this specific case, she often didn't trust those specific sensors. It's not like every engineer on the ground in mission control was going, oh yeah, it's a sensor reading. We don't really need to regard, we can disregard that. We don't need to worry about that.
Yeah, I guess it's probably like, I don't know what they call that, like there's a bias where it's like anytime you see a thing, it's like a recency bias type thing where it's like anytime you see it in a book like this, that means it's an important one, but we don't see all the times that they actually work.
Right.
But I was just laughing because every time it's like there's a sensor about the sensor's saying something and NASA's like, what do we need sensors for? Burn them down. When you were doing all your research and all your interviews, how were you keeping everything straight? What's your system? Did you have like Post-it notes all over? Did you have like a written out timeline? Was it all in the computer? Because it's a lot of people. I know you know that, but Adam, there's a lot of people in this book, a lot of characters, a lot of names. And it's at a time where everyone's name is Dick and Roger. Like Bill, they all have the same first name. Like, how did you keep it all straight in your head to actually tell the story and to know who you wanted to talk to? Like, how were you researching it all, figuring it out?
Now, it's interesting you say that because when I was approaching this for the first time, I did think to myself, well, this is going to be a lot easier than writing that book about Chernobyl, in which everyone's got a Slavic name, because
sure.
I often read Goodreads reviews, and so reading the reviews of that book, which were broadly extremely positive, but a frequent complaint was all these guys' names sound the same. They're all these confusing Russian names. So when I was when I set out to write that in the first place, I actually deliberately adopted a policy of repeating the individual's job title.
Yes,
almost,
very helpful.
Right, almost every time they were named, so that the reader could keep those people straight in their mind. And I thought, well, with the Bills and the Rogers and the Dicks and the, there's going to be no problem with that. But now what you're telling me is, oh no, there
was no problem for me, but you set it up for me. I feel like one of the things that you do so well as a writer is that you actually really take care of your reader. Like, I didn't feel confused by the science stuff. And if you know me,
that's good.
You should know that the science stuff is usually when I see science things, my eyes glaze over and I'm like, okay, physics. But I felt like you really distilled that. And I felt like I did know who everybody was, but I want to know how you kept everybody straight as you were researching. Did you have a big poster board with everybody's names? Did you have a timeline for yourself as you were crafting it to make sure okay, this person goes here, or this thing happened on this date and this thing happened on this date and they're connected. So I need to make sure,
right.
How were you organizing all the information?
It would be great if I had a big pinboard with, no, I don't have that and don't do that. And part of the reason for that is that I know myself well enough at this point that I understand that if I took the approach that I was going to set off and I'd say, okay, I'm going to research this subject. I'm going to figure out exactly what the story is and who all the characters are, and I'm going to plan it out. And then only when that is completely ready am I going to sit down and start writing. Because I know that day would never come. I would just be happy to keep researching forever if there was the deadline would just come and go, essentially, is what I'm saying. So what I do is I do an initial, when I'm thinking about the idea, I'll like read through the secondary material and see if I can understand what the story is and what aspects of the story are important to me in constructing a narrative, and to see that I understand it in that way. And then I will go off and start reporting based on what I think the story is. Now, at that point, you're going to start encountering not only, things that in that secondary material just aren't true or accurate, but also you're going to discover kind of interesting tributaries and, more importantly, individual protagonists whose stories are sort of fascinating, and so it's I guess the fancy way of saying it would be that it's an iterative process.
Okay, that sounds fancy. That's very fancy.
So it's, I will grow to understand what the narrative is as I'm working on it. And I'll go and I will write. I've written both books actually in largely chronological order. So it means that I can, you can write the first few chapters where you're writing about the background, and then you can find people who will help to illustrate that, or you can build up protagonists within that framework. When you go back and rewrite and insert, and then I would often find, material in the research that people have not come across before that will change the narrative or will change the structure of the story. And that is exactly what happened with Roger Beaujolais' memoir, because I had worked on the book for 2 years, all during COVID. And during that time, all of the federal archives were closed. So I had known at the very beginning that I would need to get into those archives to gather information. But almost as soon as I started work on the book, they closed. And it took 2 years for them to open again. And when I found Roger Beaujolais' memoir, I was looking for something else. And it was only that, I was following the Robert Caro dictum of turn every page. So I'd gone down to the National Air and Space Museum archive to look through some transcripts of interviews with senior NASA officials that this guy, Joe Trento, who wrote one of the 2 books that was published about the accident in the immediate aftermath that was published in 1987. And I'd gone down to look through these transcripts, but I took care of that in like half a day. And then there were 3 cartons of material in Joe and Susan Trento's archive. And I just thought, well, okay, well now I've just got to go through every single piece of paper in the rest of these boxes, just in case. And it was only, I discovered in a padded envelope at the end of one of the boxes, there was the CD in a transparent jewel case. And I thought, well, this was put in here sometime in the 90s, probably. And even if it was readable in a format that's available now, there's probably nothing interesting on it, if there's anything. So, and it was only, during that process where I went to the archivist and I said, I don't suppose, this is kind of ridiculous, but I've found the CD. Do you think you could take a look and see if you could read it, if there's anything on it? And they were like, oh, yeah, why don't you just go to lunch and I'll hand it over to the IT people and they'll take a look at it and see if it's, scan it for viruses. And so I went off to the museum shop and got a sandwich and came back half an hour later. And I said, Elizabeth, do you I don't suppose you had any luck with that CD? And she went, oh, no, take a look down on the computer at the end of the room. You go down there and have a look. And I went and sat down. It was like, oh yeah, there's a Word document here. And it was 600 pages long. And it was God. Roger Beaujolais telling his whole story.
Incredible. Were you just like, holy shit? Were you was it just like, that's like gotta be, you're an investigative journalist. That's gotta be like a huge moment for you. You found like a first person account of exactly the thing that you want.
Right. And the thing was that, I had drafted a lot of the first half or 2/3 of the book by that point. And so I knew that obviously Beaujolais, because of his role in trying to stop the launch, was a central protagonist. But I didn't have very much access to information about him because he died in 2012, and he'd given interviews and done lectures before he died, but he hadn't, gone into a detailed account of his whole background before the accident so That's exactly what it was. But then I made the mistake of saying to the archivist, I said, do you think I could print this out? Because I was only there for 2 days, and by this time, this is the end of the second day. And she said, well, what is it? And I said, oh, it's an unpublished manuscript of a memoir. She said, oh, well, if it's a manuscript, no, you can't, because that's copyrighted material. So you can only print 10% of it. You can have 60 pages. So I just had to like go through it and scan it.
Holy
and
shit!
Scan through it and like make as many notes as possible. Because at this point, there was still a huge backlog of people wanting to get into these archives. So you had to make an appointment months in advance. So I was like, okay, well, let's go to the key dates. Let's see. And so I got what I could out of it and then left. And it wasn't until a couple of weeks later that I was talking to Brian Russell, who is one of the surviving rocket engineers from Morton Thiokol, who was in that meeting the night before the launch. And I mentioned to him that I'd found Roger Beaujolais' memoir. At which point, Brian said, oh, yeah, Roger's memoir. Yeah, no, I've got a copy of that. And I was like, I'd already been to Brian's house and spent like an entire day talking to him. Gosh. He hadn't mentioned Roger's memoir at all because, only a handful of people had been entrusted with copies of it and they'd done so on the basis that they wouldn't show it to anyone else. But in the end, I figured out that there was more than one copy.
Were the 60 pages that you printed out, was your first gut instinct, were those the best pages? Or when you got a full copy, were you like, oh, thank God I got this because this is where the real juice is?
Oh, no. I mean, the 60 pages I was interested in were the obvious turning points in the story, his story. Like, so when he arrives at Morton Thiokol, when he first discovers that the problems with the O-rings are a lot worse than he's ever seen. But, those kinds of things. So definitely those were useful, but it was really the wider context of his story, the kind of person he was, the way that he reacted to individual events in his life, what kind of personality he had, that kind of thing. You needed to read the whole thing. You needed to see, the way he was with his wife and kids, for example.
Yeah. One of the things I always like to talk to writers about is how you write. When you sit down to actually write the book or as you're writing the book, where are you writing? How often? How many hours a day? Do you listen to music? Do you have snacks and beverages? Do you light a candle? Do you have rituals? How does Adam Higginbotham make the magic happen?
Well, I like the idea that you think it's magic.
It is.
I could write.
This book is good, Adam. This is a really good book. I read a lot of books. I love this one.
I can write a maximum of 500 words a day.
Okay.
So I have to be very disciplined about it and approach it like going to work. And I figured that out because, years ago when I was writing long magazine features, I figured out that, whatever the deadline was, I could write 1,000 words on a Monday. But then when I came to my desk on Tuesday, I'd produce nothing of any use at all. I mean, I could sit there and write as much as I like, but none of it would be any good. And in the end, I worked out that the average target was 500 words a day. So that means that I would sit down at my desk at 9 o'clock in the morning and I wouldn't be able to get up until I'd written 500 words. So that's really all I'm trying to do. And some days it is impossible to write 500 words, and I just sit there. So I could sit there until 3 o'clock in the afternoon and not have a single usable syllable, but then write the 500 words between 3 and 5 because that's I've just got to get it done because. Frankly, otherwise the prospect of actually writing an entire book seems so overwhelming that I'd never be able to do it. You just got to do it in little bits.
Right. What about snacks and beverages?
I have a joke with my wife that anything that she puts in the space between the keyboard and the computer screen will disappear by the end of the day. Okay. So please to avoid doing that.
Yeah. Okay.
Because otherwise, by the end of the process, I'll be the size of a house.
Okay. So you're not a snack guy.
I'm not a snack guy. I have 1 cup of coffee in the morning. And that's it, really. I mean, to the extent that I have a process, that's it. It's 500 words a day, whatever happens. At least 5 days a week.
Okay. I like that. What about a word you can never spell correctly on the first try?
Massachusetts.
Ooh, that's a hard one.
Massachusetts.
That's a really hard one.
Yeah.
And you're from England.
Yeah, so I have an excuse.
No, that's not what I was going to say. You have no excuse. No, I'm a terrible speller, so everyone has an excuse. Just being alive is an excuse not to know how to spell in my book. But you're from England. Are you a football guy?
No, my interest in watching football, which was obsessive when I was a child, evaporated at around the same time that my interest in becoming an astronaut did. When I was about 12. So ask me, anything you like about the 1982 World Cup. Total expert.
Okay,
I still know all the players, but no.
Who was your team as a kid?
Manchester United, because I grew up in a part of England where, all the local football teams were just dreadful. No chance. So at that
I'm
point,
sad about this. I was really hoping you were going to be a soccer football guy because we're really my family, we're into it. We're city people.
Oh,
Man
really?
City. Yeah, we're city people, which I know now is not good, but I'm new to it, but I really like it. And anytime I have anyone on the show who's from England, I'm like, who's your team? Who's your team?
No, I'm sorry to disappoint you.
It's okay. The book is good enough that I'll forgive you, but like if you'd written a mediocre book, I'd be like, oh, okay, interview's over. Okay, what's the next thing? Do you have the next thing? Do you know what you want to write about next or what you want to explore next or not yet?
I don't. I'm still in this book at the moment.
Yeah.
I'm kind of, I can tell you that, I mean, never say never, but I'm going to try and avoid writing anything more about 1986.
Until you do my book, you got to do my life story. Of course. Obviously. We're in contract already. I know I always like to think when folks write like multiple books kind of in the same world of things that I'm into, I'm like, ooh, I wonder what he'll do next, because I'm excited to read it. I'm like, I wonder what the thing will be that will excite you enough to sit down and do the research and write again. But I will be thrilled to read it no matter what it is.
Well, why don't you tell me?
I don't know. Well, it's hard because I don't know. The things that I always want to read about are like cults and stuff, but you don't really do cults. You sort of do like institutional failure events. So I'm maybe Princess Diana. That might be interesting, right? Because that's sort of like the failure of the crown.
Right.
Go in and do that.
Right.
What else would be interesting? And that's 11 years later. So you'd have a little time. You could learn about the 90s, move forward. What else is good in the 90s? I've just read 3 Waco books last year. So that's sort of, I feel like, been taken care of.
Wait, 3 Waco books came out in the
3 books came out last year. And that's the kind of stuff I'm really into. So I read all 3 and interviewed all three of the authors. Yeah, but I can always do another Jonestown book. But I feel like that's slightly different than what you do. I feel like you are like more people who knew better should have done better, not like people who have a cult had a cult.
Right. I must admit that I would like to write about something where everything goes right.
Oh no, I don't want to read that. No, thank you. No thanks.
I would, yeah, I would.
What even would that be?
I don't know, just a story of heroism, not heroism and disaster.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I think you're on the right track with whatever you're doing now. But you know what, Adam? I'll read it. I will read it and I probably will like it, but I would prefer a disaster. I love a disaster. Let me ask you, I have just 2 more questions for you. One is for people who love Challenger, what other books would you recommend to them that you think are sort of in conversation with what you've done? It doesn't have to be the same topic. It could be similar style, similar kinds of books.
I am a big fan of a book written by Rachel Slade, who actually reviewed this book for the New York Times, called Into the Raging Sea.
Okay.
Which is just a terrific book about the sinking of the Faro, which was a merchant ship that went down in a hurricane.
Whoa! I've never heard of that.
Oh, it's a really amazing book. Into the Raging Sea, it's called. But as you may be able to tell, I'm interested in when things do go wrong. So another book that I'm a huge fan of is a book called A Voyage for Madmen, which is, I'm trying to remember the author's name. I think it's Peter Nichol. Nichol is definitely.
We'll link to it in the show notes. We'll get the correct author.
Right. It's called A Voyage for Madmen, and it's about the 1968 Observer newspaper single-handed round-the-world yacht race. And
oh my gosh, I don't know about this either.
Oh, it's start with this one. It's just a brilliant story, and it's like it's got a cast of half a dozen men who participate in this race before GPS and satellite tracking and cell phones, and they each set off from the south coast of England to circumnavigate the world single-handed. And each of the participants in the race has their own crazy story.
Oh my gosh.
It's a fantastic story, and it's brilliantly told.
Okay.
So I would definitely say that.
I can't wait.
And I'm trying to think of something else that isn't sea orientated. Oh, Final Cut, which is a Hollywood book about the making of Heaven's Gate. It's called Final Cut: Dreams in Disaster in the Making of Heaven's Gate by Stephen Back. And it is it's one of the best books ever written about Hollywood. It's about how Michael Cimino made this catastrophic Western at the end of the 70s. That's a brilliant book.
I'm so excited. You've just added 3 good books that I cannot wait to read. Okay, last question. If you could have any person, dead or alive, read Challenger, who would you want it to be?
Roger Beaujolais.
Good pick. All right. Adam, thank you so much. This was such a joy for me. I, as you know, love the book. I'm so happy that we got to talk. And for people at home, you can get the book now. It is out in the world. I read most of it off the page. I listened to some of the audiobook. The audiobook narrator does a fantastic job. It's just, I co-sign this book in all of its forms. Adam, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Tracy. It was great to talk to you.
And everyone else, we will see you in the stacks. All right, y'all, that does it for us this week. Thank you so much for listening. And thank you again to Adam Higginbotham for joining the show. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to Ava Cairns for helping to make this conversation possible. Don't forget, the Stacks Book Club pick for July is Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler, which we will discuss on Wednesday, July 31st with Emily Roboteau. If you love this show and you want inside access to it, head to patreon.com/thestacks to join the Stacks Pack. And you can check out my newsletter at tracythomas.substack.com. Make sure you're subscribed to The Stacks wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening through Apple Podcasts or Spotify, be sure to leave us a rating and a review. For more from The Stacks, follow me on social media at The Stacks Pod on Instagram, Threads, and TikTok, and at The Stacks Pod _ on Twitter. And you can check out my website, thestackspodcast.com. This episode of The Stacks was edited by Christian Duenas with production assistance from Lauren Tyree. Our graphic designer is Robin McCrite, and our theme music is from Tagirigis. The Stacks is created and produced by me, Tracy Thomas.